He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole wide world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands.
I don't know what that was all about, but welcome back to the Ministry of Truth. I am Javi, the number one host on this show. Don't forget, tonight, 8 o'clock, debate time. Anyway, before we get that, though, I was watching a little TV, a little YouTube, no big deal. Ran across a couple videos that I think would go good. One of them is more censorship by big tech towards one of my favorite presidential candidates at this moment. And then we're going to do a little history on the World's Fair and about human zoos. So before we do that, though, we always got to get a little patriotic music going on. It's not the one you guys think it's going to be. Same person. But it's still, let's get it.
Well, if it weren't for my old dogs and the good Lord, they'd have me strung up in the psych ward.
Me too.
Every day living in this new world is one too many days to me. Son, we're on the brink of the next world war, and I don't think nobody's praying no more, and I ain't saying I know it for sure. I'm just down on my knees begging the Lord to take me home. I wanna go home. I don't know which road to go. It's been so long. I just know I didn't used to wake up feeling this way, cussing myself every damn
Good,
day.
Dunya.
There's always some kind of bill to pay. People just doing what the rich man say. I wanna go home. Now 4 generations farming the ground. Grandson sells it to a man out of town. And 2 weeks later, the trees go down.
Living off the grid. Fucking amazing, isn't it?
Growing around. I wanna go home. I wanna go home. I don't know which road to go. It's been so long. I just know I didn't used to wake up feeling this way, cussing myself every damn day. People have really gone and lost their way. They all just do what the TV say. I wanna go home.
Oliver Anthony. Nah, this dude.
If it weren't for my old dogs and the good Lord,
he came out with a song a month ago that pretty much just took everybody by storm. It's number one in 3 countries, plus number one in the Hot 100. Well, obviously not that song, but one of them. Is that for me? Anyway, back to big tech censoring. So apparently LinkedIn doesn't like a specific presidential candidate that's not named Donald Trump, but is also like a brown millennial version of Donald J. Trump. So obviously, this isn't a Vivek and how he's being censored by big tech, which I kind of thought was done with.
I was a bit surprised to get an email noting that my LinkedIn account had been shut down. I wondered why, because actually a number of friends texted me saying they follow me on LinkedIn. That's how they keep up. They weren't able to find me anymore. And so when I had my team get in touch with LinkedIn, here's the response that we got. I'm not kidding. I'm reading from this. Your account was restricted for sharing content that contains
I'll take a look at
misleading
that,
or
like a
inaccurate
Popo song.
information. They said what it was.
Just
One was
this.
a video where in the video I said, the CCP is playing the Biden administration like a Chinese mandolin. China has weaponized the woke pandemic to stay one step ahead, and it's working. That was the first offense. The second offense was one where I said that if the climate religion was really about climate change, then they'd be worried about shifting oil production from the US to places like Russia and China. Yet the climate religion and its apostles in the ESG movement have a very different objective. That was my second offense. And apparently my third strike was to say this: the climate agenda is a lie. Fossil fuels are a requirement for human prosperity. Those were my three strikes. That got me censored on LinkedIn.
And had
This is
nothing to
staggering.
do
So
with
we didn't push back, and
terrorism,
what do we say?
hate
We
speech.
actually got specifics on how we're actually, hate speech, misinformation, and violence. Those were the policies that I was actually violating. Now, I got a kick out of this. I'm going to be honest. I'm sure that we're going to get this escalated because I'm a U.S. presidential candidate.
Yep.
We have the connectivity to the people that we need to talk to be able to get my LinkedIn account back. But I'm not bringing this about because it's about me. I'm bringing this up because if they can do it to me, they can really do it to anybody for making statements about the climate change movement and agenda in this country that are grounded in fact, and then express an opinion based on those facts. To make a statement about Biden's relationships with China and criticize his China policies as a result. To say that that's going to be characterized as misinformation, hate speech, and violence per LinkedIn's terms of service. This is a Microsoft-owned company. It shows what's going on in this country.
Bill Gates.
These aren't really the actions of private companies. These are so-called privately held companies or publicly traded private companies that are doing the work of the government through the back door, silencing speech that the government would never dare censor, could never censor under the Constitution, but use the back door of tech companies to get it done instead. That's even more dangerous than direct government censorship in many ways.
Crack down on the
because
other
it is a
company.
hybrid of corporate power and state power together, doing what neither one of them could do on their own. That's really what this is about. So I'm not worried about me. I'll get my LinkedIn account back, I'm sure. And if not, I'll still be fine. Believe me. I'm doing it because it's a symptom of how deep this cancer has run in our country. And believe me, we will stop at nothing in restoring free speech in our country, in restoring internet freedoms in our country. I've been writing about these issues for several years.
You mean
I was
net
actually one of the
neutrality?
first people in this country to expose the way government was colluding with big tech to get done through the back door. It's dirty work. And so it seems like karma that they've come back and actually punished me for it in the form of censoring my speech about climate change and about China policy. But believe me, I'm not going to stay censored. We're going to get this done through the national revival that we're leading starting next year.
Vivek Ramaswamy's experience with LinkedIn censorship sheds light on the growing concerns surrounding.
Just wanted y'all to hear his story, not the rest of that article or that news or that segment, because it's all fucking AI. That's the only part that really mattered. Now back to human zoos. Okay. In the World's Fair, I can't remember, it's early 1900s in New York City, right around Central Park, actually. They used to have an exhibition there called the Human Zoo. Now, the Human Zoo took bits and parts of cultures from around the world, brought them on here under false pretenses, of course, and put them in a human zoo to be on exhibit for the world to see. So we know the World's Fair they only ran for like 6 months or a month, something like that. And then it gets torn down and it got turned into Central Park. So let's get into this. It's a very interesting topic that I haven't really wanted to go over yet because I haven't found the perfect explanation that I wanted. And this is close enough.
The placing of the boy in the cage with a monkey is an outrage. The Negro race in America has a hard enough time as it is in getting away from the prejudice that is closely related to the monkey without having a member of the race placed on exhibition.
Leading men of science from Harvard and Princeton and Columbia University were saying that Africans were midway between an orangutan and a human being. So 100 years later, it should not come as much of a surprise that many people still cling to these notions of European superiority, African inferiority.
It wasn't only Africans in these zoos, though. Parts of my tribe were there. I didn't pick the music, I promise. What's up, Terrence?
The year was 1859. 3 months after Charles Darwin published his book On the Origin of Species, American promoter P.T. Barnum unveiled a new attraction at his popular museum in New York City. It featured what was described as the What Is It, or man monkey. Visitors were told that the creature had been captured by hunters in Africa, who discovered a race of beings roving among the trees and branches like apes and monkeys. Museum staff declared that the creature had been pronounced by scientists as a connecting link between African blacks and lower animals. In reality, Barnum's so-called man monkey was an African-American man named William Henry Johnson. Thanks to Barnum, Johnson spent much of his life on public display as an evolutionary missing link, sometimes in a cage. Many reporters at the time were happy to promote the deception. The New York Tribune declared that Barnum's performer seemed to be a cross between an ape species and a Negro.
No, he's a
another
Moor.
paper declared,
the head is shaped like that of a monkey, but the face is more like that of an African Negro of the lower order. It has been pronounced by naturalists as a specimen of the connecting link between man and monkey.
Not true.
Many more supposed missing links were marketed to the public at freak shows throughout America. In the 1880s, there was Crow, promoted as living proof of Darwin's theory of the descent of man. She was described as a perfect specimen of the step between man and monkey. Actually, Crow was a young woman from Southeast Asia who suffered from hypertrichosis, a rare genetic condition that produces excessive hair. In the early 1900s, there was Congo, the ape man, usually exhibited in a cage next to a chimpanzee. Most of these early presentations of missing links were crude hoaxes put forward by hucksters, not scientists. But the quest to dramatize the lower stages of human evolution eventually reached far beyond freak shows. It ultimately involved the most elite members of the scientific community, and it was given a platform at one of the most celebrated events in early 20th century America. Today, Forest Park in St. Louis is a place for walking, or riding a bicycle, or spending a quiet Sunday afternoon.
That was a World's
Fair. But more than a century ago, it was one of the most visited locations in the entire United States. The site of the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair. Attracting more than 19 million visitors, the World's Fair was known for its lavish neoclassical buildings, its 22-story-high Ferris wheel, and the public debut of innovations such as the X-ray machine and the ice cream cone.
Oh yeah, you know I am.
But the fair had a darker side.
That's us. Hairy anus.
Organizers imported thousands of indigenous peoples from around
Well,
the
I don't know
world
if it's a bunch
to be
of
put on
buildings that are already
public
there. The
display.
buildings they built, typically, they took a couple years to build, but they tore them down after 6 months, which makes no fucking sense. Each site has one main building left, and that was the main building for the World's Fair. The World's Fair in Nashville, the only thing left is a life-size, what's that motherfucking thing in Rome? I can't remember the fucking name of it. The one in Indiana, it's a library / museum.
In what
New
was
York,
essentially
I think
a
it turned into
giant
Central
human
Park.
zoo. Unlike freak shows, the human zoo
But
in St. Louis was created.
Staying on top of those buildings that were already there, a lot of the buildings we have now, especially in these bigger cities, those were built on top of other buildings covered in 20 feet of mud.
The cooperation of America's scientific establishment. The man behind the human zoo was anthropologist William McGee. One of the nation's leading scientists, McGee had already served as acting president of the American Association for the Advancement of Science. In 1903, he was asked to head the anthropology department for the World's Fair. McGee had grand plans of presenting the story of human evolution by displaying representatives of what he considered lower stages of the human race. McGee's plans reflected the ideas of mainstream anthropology of the time.
Anthropology was kind of founded on this idea of mapping civilization from the highest to the lowest, right? With the lowest at that time said to be
You also got to think at that time they were building these different reality, different time frame. Nobody knows if it was 1850s or 850. And that's the thing. There's 1,000 years missing. So you could be right, but there's plenty of old photographs of them building the World's Fairs. Mainly the one in Chicago, and I've seen those of Nashville.
Up. Leading men of science from Harvard and Princeton and Columbia University were saying that Africans were midway between an orangutan and a human being.
Like many scientists of his day, McGee drew inspiration for his ideas on human development from Darwin's theory that humans had evolved from ape-like ancestors.
Darwin's theory provided a template for categorizing Africans as biological inferiors. His impact created a bandwagon effect on many scholars on both sides of the Atlantic. Africans were demeaned with terms like savages and compared to animals. Admittedly, some of these comparisons were used before
I know what you meant.
But after Darwin, they increasingly
oddly enough, Tartarus is a play off of Tartaria. The Greeks used it, obviously, to identify Tartarus, which is hell.
Science.
Darwin argued that the break in evolutionary history between apes and men came between Africans and Australian Aborigines and gorillas.
They destroyed Tartarian people and its empire for a reason.
Were the closest humans to apes. German scientist Ernst Haeckel helped popularize the idea.
Ernst Haeckel was the leading German Darwinist in the late 19th and early 20th century. He corresponded extensively with Darwin, and Darwin recognized Haeckel's affinity with his own theory.
Ernst Haeckel also is known for his raving racism. And in fact, he had a graphic of the history of human evolution that, in very pointed terms, really embedded a racist view of human evolution. You have the Teutonic male on the top, the sort of the Germanic male, and then at the bottom, you had some creatures that looked partly like apes, partly like Jews. He was also
okay. I know you are.
And in the middle, you have the transition from the ape-like creatures to the first human creatures. The ape-like creatures look pretty much like they're Africans. And the takeaway point that Ernst Haeckel
I don't know why they keep calling them Africans. The people they're showing, these big fat fucking noses. Those are a Native American tribe from Florida called the Moors. And there's a whole theory I had. I think I did it on Rumble. I don't know you, but I remember the name. I did a whole thing on Rumble about something that I just lost track.
Was that the difference between the highest human being, they're Africans, and the...
there it is. So they were called the Moors, right? And the Moors, I believe, right around, the whole time where history is foggy, I believe the Moors were imprisoned by other Moors and sold to the colonizers, which actually were there in the early 1300s because the Vikings actually were the first European settlers to settle in, I think, Nova Scotia. No, it's on the eastern part of Canada, and they went from there. And I think they just wanted to live off the land. It's the Knights Templars, or today known as the Masons. They came over and pretty much everything started from there. And it wasn't really Newfoundland. Thank you. I don't know why I couldn't think of that. But yeah, I forgot where I was going. Damn it. Yeah, but the Moors, I thought it was more of the 1300s. But then again,
takeaway point
time between 1800 and 1850 kind of
was that the difference
hazy.
between the highest human being and the lowest human being, the gap between the highest Teutonic male and the first human being that was just one step above the apes, was larger than the gap between the lowest human being and the highest ape.
At the St. Louis World Fair, William McGee expressed a similar view, arguing that scientists had now shown
the structure of the lowest humans more nearly resembles that of the highest ape-like animals than that of the highest humans.
Like other scientists of the era, McGee saw primitive non-white peoples as living evidence of man's evolutionary history.
The savage stands strikingly close to subhuman species in every aspect of mentality, as well as in bodily habits and bodily
those
structure.
look like relatives.
McGee was determined to use primitive peoples at the fair to dramatize for the public the different stages of human evolution, beginning with races he considered lowest on the evolutionary scale.
They're dead. I don't think they need the cash app.
McGee arranged for native peoples to be put on display in villages designed to recreate their native habitats. These villages were enclosed by fences, making them truly seem like human zoos. More than 4 million fairgoers reportedly visited these anthropological displays, eagerly staring at and poking at the indigenous peoples in their enclosures. Adding to the indignities, native peoples were pressured to participate in a series of athletic contests designed to show they were biologically inferior to whites. Those on display were also subjected to experiments in a special laboratory set up by the fair's anthropology department. Directed by a psychology professor from Columbia University, the lab conducted tests to measure native people's
I don't
intelligence.
think it's that people don't know about it. Granted, I know a lot of people that don't know about it, but a lot of people just don't care. And that's the problem in the world, because this could happen again if people forget about it.
And physical features, and even their threshold for pain. Some scientists came to the fair with more gruesome plans. Alish Hrdlicka was an anthropologist at the Smithsonian. He came to St. Louis hunting for dead bodies. Hrdlicka was obsessed with analyzing the brains of other races to gain insight into human evolution. He went on to assemble a collection of hundreds of embalmed human brains, many of them still stored by the Smithsonian.
Oh.
Hrdlicka extracted a promise from doctors in St. Louis to hand over the brains of any of the natives who might die while on display at the fair. Native peoples were brought to the St. Louis Exposition from the far corners of the globe. From Japan came representatives of the Ainu people. Patagonians came from South America. Igorots and Negritos came from the Philippines.
Igorots.
Both were thought by scientists of the time to be near the bottom of the evolutionary ladder.
Motherfucker, no we weren't.
The Negritos were even marketed at the fair as another missing link between humans and apes. But perhaps the most exotic people group brought to St. Louis for public display were pygmies from the African Congo.
Will the pygmies brought last week to the World's Fair prove Darwin's theory of the missing link? Will a study of the little black children of the African jungle shed light on the theory evolved by Darwin as regards?
I wonder if they were part of the orphan trains once the world exhibits were done.
The evolution of the human race?
They know they didn't send them
Dr.
home.
W.J. McGee, chief of the anthropology department of the World's Fair, is convinced that it will. This is the first time that the Aboriginal people of Africa have been brought to an English-speaking country. This is the first opportunity that has been presented to scientists to study them. Many characteristics were noticed in the pygmies that closely resemble the ape or the simian type. It is believed that the pygmies, who are said to represent the lowest form of human development, are next removed from the simian family.
The pygmies appearing at the St. Louis World's Fair had been transported from Africa by former missionary turned explorer Samuel Phillips Werner. Werner had gone to Africa with the explicit goal of finding pygmies to display at
You
the
really
fair.
went to Africa to hunt?
He had gone to the Congo heavily armed, and he had gone hunting for these people he called pygmies, these diminutive people of the Central African forest.
The fair's anthropologist William McGee repeatedly compared the pygmies to monkeys and apes. In the journal Science, he even asserted that pygmies were commonly considered to approach subhuman types more closely than any other variety of the genus
theory,
Homo.
right? Hear me out. Anybody who's a descendant of anybody that was in the World's Fair's human zoo, technically they're entitled to reparations if you think about it.
They were considered by men of science at
Aside
that
from the
time
Japanese
to be
and the
lowest
Jewish people,
form
they're
of
modern day
humans,
slavery.
or in some thought they were subhuman.
The pygmies
Not
were
slavery,
less than
but
thrilled by their welcome at the fair.
The Americans treat
tournament.
us as they do our pet monkey. They laugh at us and poke their umbrellas into our faces. They do the same to our monkey.
One pygmy at the fair became a special celebrity. His name was Ota Benga. Samuel Werner had purchased him at a slave market.
Jesus.
Ota Benga
Wait.
was advertised to fairgoers.
In the 1900s? So there were still slaves in the 1900s? You mean to tell me there was... Wait. But I thought... No problem, Lala.
As the only genuine African cannibal
Have a good
in
day.
America today. For a nickel, he would display his pointed teeth that supposedly enabled him to eat human flesh. At the end of the fair, the pygmies returned to Africa with Samuel Werner.
Oh, so they did take him back.
But in 1906, Werner brought Ota Benga back to America.
Never mind.
It would prove a fateful choice. Samuel Werner returned from Africa to New York City on July the 30th, 1906.
What's up, DJ Fruit Loop? I'm
Arriving
sorry.
on the SS Armenian from Liverpool. He was accompanied by 2 chimpanzees, a snake, a parrot, and 50 boxes of materials from Africa that he hoped to sell to museums. He was also joined by Ota Benga. Werner quickly departed New York, leaving Benga at the American Museum of Natural History in Manhattan. Established in 1869, the museum
that
was
building.
already
Look at
becoming
the
one of the
architecture
premier
on that.
scientific institutions in the world. Ota Benga was largely left free to wander the museum's exhibit halls. When Samuel Werner eventually returned to New York, he was fighting off creditors, and the museum wanted him to find new lodgings for Ota Benga. So Werner worked out an agreement to move Ota Benga to the New York Zoological Park, otherwise known as the Bronx Zoo. Spread over more than 260 acres, the Bronx Zoo had been envisioned by its founders as the largest zoo in the world. and the grandest zoological establishment on Earth. The zoo was directed by William Temple Hornaday. A noted zoologist, Hornaday formerly worked at the Smithsonian, and he had already founded the National Zoo
I knew
in
they had
Washington,
one in there.
D.C. Overseeing Hornaday,
I didn't know there was
an
one in St.
executive
Louis.
committee chaired by Henry Fairfield Osborn, a distinguished professor at Columbia University. Hornaday and Osborn had dreams of exhibiting more than just animals at their new zoo.
One of the people they brought was the Igorots from the Philippines, and that was my tribe.
Wanted to install Native Americans on zoo grounds, with Osborn promising that one day the Indian and his teepee would take their place next to the zoological park's buffalo.
It's just people want to
They
be
had their chance to put their first human on display.
People like to hear new
Hornaday
things
quickly
that aren't
agreed
new.
to purchase one of Werner's chimpanzees and to house both the chimp and Otobenga at the zoo. Hornaday planned to exhibit the pygmy and the chimpanzee together in a cage in the zoo's monkey house.
It was presented as science, not as a circus act, because these were men of science who were doing this.
Otobenga went on display in the monkey house on Saturday, September the 8th, 1906. The next day, a sign was placed on the cage.
I do too,
explaining
DJ
the
Pro
new
Luke.
exhibit.
The African pygmy, Otobenga.
I like to
Age,
stay
23 years.
somewhat educated,
Height,
so to
4
speak.
feet 11 inches. Weight, 103 pounds. Brought from the Kasai River, Congo Free State. Exhibited each afternoon during September.
Thousands of New Yorkers came to stare and laugh and debate the meaning of the display. Is it a man? Some of them wondered. Newspaper coverage brought even more people, and in just a few weeks, the zoo drew nearly a
There it
quarter
is.
million visitors. But the notoriety also brought controversy. New York's clergy, in particular, were horrified at what they saw as a dehumanizing spectacle. First to speak out was the Reverend Robert Stewart MacArthur, pastor of the city's Calvary Baptist Church, one of the largest Baptist congregations in America.
The person responsible for this exhibition degrades himself as much as he does the African. Instead of making a beast of this little fellow, he should be put in school.
Ministers from New York's African-American community soon organized a protest
Hey,
committee.
Vlad, what's up, brother?
After visiting the zoo and seeing Benga for themselves, they were horrified.
They thought it was outrageous. They clearly saw a human being who appeared to be afraid, who was being heckled and jeered at and things thrown at him, and he was being, debased on the hallowed grounds of the New York Zoological Society in New York City.
The ministers demanded that Otobenga be taken off display and be offered an education. James H. Gordon, superintendent of the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum in Brooklyn, appealed to the zoo to end the spectacle.
If Professor
Orphan
Werner
trains, huh?
found difficulty in disposing of the boy, why did he not apply to us? We would have seen that he was well cared for.
Gordon also denounced the way the young African was being used as a prop to prove Darwinian evolution.
This is a Christian country, and the exhibition evidently aims to be a demonstration of the Darwinian theory of evolution.
He really should have.
The theory of evolution absolutely is opposed to Christianity, and a public demonstration in its favor should not be permitted. Neither the Negro nor the white man is related to the monkey. Such an exhibition only degrades a human being's manhood. We do not like this exhibition of one of our race with the monkeys. Our race, we think, is depressed enough without exhibiting one of us with the apes. We think we are worthy of being considered human beings with souls.
Samuel Werner tried to deflect the criticism, denying that he put Otobenga on display to show that he was somehow subhuman.
Right.
If Otobenga is in a cage, he is only there to look after the animals.
Zoo director Hornaday
an in-house
meanwhile
zookeeper?
declared that the black minister's protest was ridiculous.
Though a believer myself in the Darwinian theory, I had no idea of using the exhibition to enforce it. The boy is on exhibition simply because the public wishes to see him. He is well treated and happy. To say that the boy is placed in the cage to show his similarities to the monkey is nonsense. He is much more intelligent than many white men whom I have known.
Hornaday made clear that he wasn't about to shut down the popular exhibit.
We are.
The
We pay
exhibition
taxes,
shall
right?
certainly be continued, unless the directors of the park decide otherwise.
But the leaders of the New York Zoological Society were pleased by the display. Henry Fairfield Osborn even congratulated Hornaday for the excellent press coverage, commenting that Benga is certainly making his way successfully as a sensation. Spurned by Hornaday, the African-American ministers decided to appeal to George McClellan Jr., the Democratic mayor of New York. McClellan was the son of the controversial general during the Civil War, who
Fort
had tried to
McClellan's named
unseat
after him.
Abraham Lincoln in the presidential election of 1864. The elder McClellan openly confessed that he was prejudiced in favor of the white race, and said that he couldn't learn to like the odor of either billy goats or Negroes. The younger McClellan now refused to even meet with the African-American ministers, sending out an assistant with a dismissive note referring them to the New York Zoological Society. The ministers then went to see Madison Grant, the Zoological Society's secretary. Grant was a prominent member of New York Society. A graduate of Yale, he received a law degree from Columbia. He was also a trustee of the American Museum of Natural History, a counselor of the American Geographical Society, and a founder of the Bronx Zoo. It would have been hard for...
I also heard that the Abraham Lincoln we know is not the Abraham Lincoln that was actually Abraham Lincoln. They believe Abraham Lincoln was a Moor, and that he may have been African American, or at least partially.
Hard for the ministers to find someone less sympathetic.
Alexa, that's just a theory.
Grant was an open racist who thought blacks were an inferior race and regarded those who had parents of different races as mongrels. Within a decade, he would write The Passing of the Great Race, a book which championed Nordic supremacy and keeping blacks subservient to whites. The book was reportedly praised by Adolf Hitler as his Bible. Grant
I thought they were talking about
also
Viking
rebuffed the
supremacy. No big
ministers.
deal.
So did the city's most prominent newspaper, the New York Times, which professed to be puzzled by the anger of the protesters.
We do not quite understand all the emotion which others are expressing in the matter.
Describing African pygmies as very low...
Well, what you'll notice about the history that I go over versus the history that you guys remember being taught in school, this is the stuff they don't want you to remember. Because it's a black eye on society. Sorry, I almost got hard coughing. And that's a reason why I think the fact these millennial and Gen Zs are trying to erase everything that we have left from the early 1900s, because it's supposed to be forgotten. But I don't forget, and I like to share just in case, like, people may see stuff and be like, oh, okay, this actually is interesting.
In the human scale, the Times made clear that it viewed pygmies as less than fully human.
Really?
Whether they are really closer to the anthropoid apes than the other African
I
savages.
think I learned
or
about
whether
human zoos about a year ago when I was looking into the Moors and orphan trains.
they're viewed as the degenerate
I am
descendants
definitely
of ordinary
Gen Z.
Negroes. They are of equal
Can't
interest
tell.
to the student
Nice
of
and young.
ethnology and can be studied with profit.
The editors at the Times thought it absurd
I
to
made the
make
Gen
known
X
over
cutoff
the
barely.
imagined humiliation and degradation Otobenga was suffering. In fact, they claimed the pygmy was probably enjoying himself.
The suggestion that Benga should be placed in a school instead of a cage ignores the high probability that school would be a place of torture to him, and one from which he could draw no advantage whatever. The idea that men are all much alike except as they have had or lacked opportunities for getting an education out of books is now
You know what, Vlad? I will give you credit. You put the right your.
far out of date.
After African-American ministers criticized the zoo for trying to use Ota Benga to prove Darwinian evolution,
Hey, Vlad, I think
the New York Times weighed in again.
Moderators
The
here. She might
Reverend
time you
Colored
out.
Brother should
She
be
won't,
told that evolution, in one form or another, is now taught in the textbooks
See,
of
when you look at
all
this,
the schools. One form.
You remember how you say people used to like take different parts of animals and put them together and be like, "Look what I found! It's an alligator human that I found in East Liverpool, Ohio." Well, I heard wrinkly brains are good, and it's the smooth ones. And it's funny because I just heard that today.
Form or
My
another
kid.
is now taught in the textbooks of all the schools, and that it is no more debatable than the multiplication table.
As protests continued, increasingly rowdy crowds came to the zoo in order to visit the pygmy. On Sunday, September 16th, 40,000 people converged on zoo grounds to see the city's newest sensation. According to press reports, the mobs chased Ota Benga around the zoo all day, howling, jeering, and yelling.
Oh, wow.
Some of them poked him in the ribs, others tripped him. All laughed at him. Benga responded by shooting an arrow at his tormentors, after which zookeepers caught him and returned him to his cage. As both crowds and Ota Benga became unruly, Zoo Director Hornaday grew increasingly defensive.
Look at those satellites
He
he's got on
now
the side of
claimed
his
that
head.
he had decided to exhibit Ota Benga in a cage simply for convenience.
Back in
We
the
had
cage
no
for him,
platform that we could place him on, and this big open-air cage was the best place we could find to put him, where everybody could see him.
Eventually, the continued controversy made Hornaday want to wash his hands of the whole affair. Ultimately, an agreement was reached to move Ota Benga to the Howard Colored Orphan Asylum and later to a seminary in Lynchburg, Virginia. There, nearly 10 years later, Ota Benga shot himself to death.
Oh, fuck.
Benga had
Well, that
expressed a
went left
desire
real
to
quick.
return to his native Africa. But by 1916, the continent was being further ravaged by European powers as they fought World War I, so return was no longer an option.
I think the hopelessness of it all, the trauma he had sustained, the loneliness, and, I can't even imagine. He had no idea what had become of his people, if his village was still even there. So it's not hard to imagine the myriad reasons why he would have sunk into this deep depression and that ultimately caused him to take his life.
In one final indignity, the New York Times published an obituary assuring readers that during Ota Benga's stay in their city, he was actually an employee of the Bronx Zoo who had been hired to feed the apes. According to the Times, it was this employment that gave rise to the unfounded
So when you
report
see stuff like
that
that,
Ota Benga.
That's why 1984 is really a really good manual of what they're doing today. After the kid's dead, they rewrite it to where he was an employee of the zoo. Because the Ministry of Truth, get it? They're the ones that tell you the information. They take it in and rewrite it so it makes it look better for you.
Benga was being held in the park as one of the exhibits in the monkey cage. Ota Benga was largely forgotten by history until the 1990s. But the passion of social Darwinists in America for putting humans on display continued. And 15 years later, some of the same figures involved in the Ota Benga scandal would be involved in another kind of human display, one whose impact would prove even more horrifying. In September of 1921, leading scientists from around the globe gathered at the American Museum of Natural
Look at
History
those
in New York City
buildings. There's no
for the
reason
Second
why we still don't
International
have
Congress of Eugenics. Eugenics
Margaret
was the
Sanger.
science of breeding better people. The term had been coined by Charles Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton. But Darwin himself helped lay the groundwork for eugenics in his book, The Descent of Man. According to Darwin, human beings developed through a long and cruel process of natural selection or survival of the fittest. Less fit organisms died, leaving more capable organisms to reproduce and flourish. It was this ruthless process of elimination not the foresight of a designer, that had propelled human beings to the top of the evolutionary ladder. But Darwin worried that modern society was now doing its best to undermine natural selection.
We civilized men do our utmost to check the process of elimination. We build asylums for the imbecile, the maimed and the sick. We institute poor laws, and our medical men exert their utmost skill to save the life of everyone to the last moment. There is reason to believe that vaccination has preserved thousands, who from a weak constitution would formerly have succumbed to smallpox. No one who has attended to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. Hardly anyone is so ignorant as to allow his worst animals to
Look, it's
breed.
a Russian cow.
A kindly man, Darwin was troubled by the implications of his theory for society. But his followers had a solution. They thought they could apply Darwinian selection rationally and humanely through the science of eugenics, which became known as the self-direction of human evolution. Eugenics was eagerly embraced by America's scientific elites.
Sometimes today it's argued that eugenics was just fringe science. Just a few people believed in it. And of course, we don't believe in it now. That ignores the fact that for decades, eugenics was what could be called the consensus view of the scientific community.
The Eugenics Congress at the American Museum of Natural History drew scientists from America's top research institutions, including Harvard, Yale, MIT, the Smithsonian, Ohio State, UC Berkeley, and the University of Texas. Participants included inventor Alexander Graham Bell and Charles Darwin's own son, Leonard, who lashed out at the threat biological defectives pose to modern society. Scientists were welcomed to the Eugenics Congress by then-president of the American Museum of Natural History, Henry Fairfield Osborn, who had been involved in the display of Ota Benga at the Bronx Zoo. A future head of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, Osborn had become one of the most celebrated scientific champions of evolution in America. Soon,
I meant to say
become embroiled
Ukrainian
in a
because it looks
controversy with
starved.
politician William Jennings Bryan over a fossilized tooth discovered in Nebraska. Osborn insisted that the tooth supplied irrefutable evidence of the existence of man-like apes in ancient North America. To his embarrassment, the tooth later turned out to be part of an extinct pig. At the Eugenics
Trust the
Congress,
science, guys. Trust the
Osborn told
science.
scientists that eugenics was essential to the future of human evolution.
To know the worst as well as the best in heredity, to preserve and
The
to
best of the
select
race.
the best. These are the most essential forces in the future evolution of human society.
Osborn also attacked racial intermarriage.
500,000 years of human evolution have impressed certain distinctive virtues as well as faults on each race. Put three races together, you are likely to unite the vices of all three as the virtues.
Osborn argued that racial groups should be studied to determine what tasks each race is best fitted to accomplish.
Man, fuck you.
But it was clear that he already thought he knew the proper place of non-whites.
If the Negro fails in government, he may become a fine agriculturalist
What's up, Rumsky?
or a fine mechanic.
The American Museum of Natural History accompanied the Eugenics Congress with a major museum exhibition designed to sell eugenics to the American public. Participants included America's top publishers, insurance companies, government agencies, and private groups like the American Red Cross. As many as 10,000 people attended the special exhibition. There were no live humans put on display at the eugenics exhibit, but it was still a kind of human zoo. It put human racial groups under the microscope to judge their worth to society. There were displays highlighting differences between black and white babies in the womb. Displays comparing the mental stamina of different races. Displays reporting on the capabilities of immigrants. And displays showcasing equipment for measuring human intelligence and other features. There also were displays about the human brain. One compared the brains of criminals and non-criminals. But the most extensive brain display was created by anthropologist Alish Hrdlicka from his growing collection of embalmed brains. Hrdlicka left his original specimens stored in jars at the Smithsonian.
You know, I would really love to see what my brain looks like when they dissect that motherfucker. Because there's so much trauma in that bitch.
But he brought gelatin models of the embalmed brains of apes and 3 races of humans. Hrdlicka's presentation filled 7 separate display cases. It also included a series of skulls from Native Americans. The skulls purported to show that Native American brains revealed primitive features from earlier stages of evolution. In the midst of more sophisticated displays were cruder exhibits featuring the blatantly racist books of Madison Grant and Lothrop Stoddart.
I'm glad someone noticed it was my brain.
Stoddart had published The Rising Tide of Color Against White World Supremacy. Stoddart claimed that whites were in danger of being overrun by the colored races of the world.
Wait.
And he argued that immigration from what he called lower human types had to be rigorously curtailed.
Eugenists pretty universally viewed immigrants and people of non-white races as a drag on the human race.
100%.
Eugenists viewed blacks...
What I really would like to see is my brain when I was 17 years old before I went to basic training till now. I want to see how much trauma just being at 20 years caused. Or 24 years, something like that.
And Mexicans and Hispanics as throwbacks, evolutionary throwbacks that were lower races in evolutionary terms and therefore were a drain on modern society.
So I'm a throwback.
They justified this in the name of Darwinian science. You know, there were racists before the eugenists. The interesting thing about the eugenists was the way that they built on top of Darwinian biology and claimed that there was a scientific justification for racism.
The eugenics exhibition advocated a chilling agenda for public policy, including forced sterilization and harsh new restrictions on immigration. It also promoted a radical proposal advanced by the Eugenics Record Office, one of the eugenics groups participating in the exhibition. The proposal called for assembling biological profiles on all Americans to determine whether they were biologically fit to mate.
The
Eugenics Records Office was so extreme, they wanted to hold records on everyone in the United States, biological records showing their family trees, so that if you wanted to marry someone, you could write to them and they could tell you whether the person you're wanting to marry had
I'm not one of those ones that you see on TV, man. Actually, people keep bringing up that show, and I actually have never seen it.
fit family tree.
Neither are my brothers. Not
so
my
that you could marry them.
brother,
Or if they
but
had
my
bad heredity, so that you could.
brothers.
And in fact, they had exercises and packets that were given to biology teachers around the country, that one of the exercises you were supposed to do in your biology class when you were studying evolution and then eugenics was to have kids fill out this form with their family tree of who were the black sheeps of the family, what diseases they had in the family, so that these could then be sent off to the Eugenics Record Office and their vaults, and so that they could keep records on everyone.
Yo, that's pretty.
The American Museum of Natural
creepy, right?
History
Think of that.
later called the Eugenics Congress of 1921 perhaps the most important scientific meeting ever held in the museum. A decade later, the museum was at it again, hosting the Third International Congress of Eugenics in 1932. This time, it put on an even more extensive museum exhibition for the public. At the entrance to the exhibit hall were placed the busts of two men accredited as the founding fathers of eugenics, Francis Galton and Charles Darwin. Although some scientists raised concerns about eugenics, probably the strongest opposition to the movement came from traditional religion.
It's a story that Americans don't know as well as they should, and it's a story that American Christians don't know as well as they should. But at the basis of opposition to the so-called scientific eugenicist movement in the early 20th century were Christians, Protestants, Baptists, Catholics, who understood the value of every human being. That's not only a Christian value, that is fundamental to the American experiment itself.
When Nebraska's legislature passed a forced sterilization bill in 1913, Governor John Moorhead, a Presbyterian, vetoed it.
Granted, this is 1930s, right? But the sterilization thing, can't we do that to pedophiles, chomos. That's a good thing, right? Sterilize them, castrate them, all three. Yeah, whatever. They're gonna get a giant butthole in jail anyway. Yeah, I know it really isn't that long
the
ago when I
legislation
think
not
about
only
it.
violated the state's Bill of Rights, it also offended a higher law.
This proposed legislation seems more in keeping with the pagan age than with the teachings of Christianity.
What age?
Man is more than an animal.
While many modernist clergy supported eugenics, theologically conservative religious figures were much more skeptical. American evangelical William Jennings Bryan, for example, denounced eugenics as an impossible system for scientific breeding under which a few supposedly superior intellects, self-appointed, would direct the mating and the movements of the mass of mankind. But the most consistent opposition to eugenics came from Roman Catholics. In 1930, Pope Pius XI strongly condemned forced sterilization for eugenics in one of his encyclicals. The Pope criticized eugenists for asking the government to assume a power which it can never legitimately possess.
The most fundamental principle of Catholic social teaching is the intrinsic dignity of every human being. In other words, people are valuable simply as creatures made in the image and likeness of God. They're not valuable merely because they have economic value or they're productive or they're smart. They have value in and of themselves as spiritual creatures made in God's image. That idea obviously contradicts the fundamental principle of eugenics, which is through either passive or active means to,
like from the beginning of the 1900s,
favor particular ethnic groups over others.
Across America, Catholic clergy actively resisted the eugenics crusade. In Louisiana, the Catholic Church played a key role in preventing the passage of a sterilization law. Catholic opposition to eugenics was so pronounced that some eugenics groups targeted the Catholic Church for attacks. The Human Betterment Foundation in California was dedicated to promoting eugenics through forced sterilization. Its president, E.S. Gosney, lashed out at Catholic efforts to block sterilization laws.
Every legislature considering a sterilization bill in the United States is visited by representatives of the bishop or archbishop who lay down the law of Rome to those willing to accept it. The henchmen are prompt to fall in line.
Gosney suggested that the Catholic Church should be asked to pay for Catholics who aren't
So the country was founded on Christian values, but the Catholic Church can run pretty much the government in some of these cities right back then. So who's the real devil?
sterilized.
If Catholics do not want their feeble-minded communicants sterilized, it would seem more logical to ask them, as Hitler has done in Germany, to keep these feeble-minded segregated at their own expense, in order that the American Commonwealth may be subjected to no unnecessary damage from the presence of a great body of defectives, who increase the amount of human misery, contribute largely to the ranks of the delinquent and criminal, augment the tax burdens, diminish the efficiency of industry, and dilute the quality of American citizenship.
The eugenics movement and the supporters of eugenics in the early 20th century actually tried to make an anti-Catholic campaign part of their public argument. On the one hand, they claimed that their ideas were based firmly in natural science, and yet they actually ran a public campaign that was anti-religious. You get the impression that there was something more than simple empirical science at stake in the debate.
Despite opposition from Catholics and others, the American eugenics movement continued to flourish in the years leading up to World War II. The eugenics movement eventually led to the forced sterilization of more than 60,000 people in America. Compulsory sterilization in the name of eugenics was ultimately upheld by the United States Supreme Court in a decision that declared, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Many of those sterilized would not be considered mentally handicapped today. The eugenics movement also succeeded in securing the passage of a draconian immigration law that sharply restricted the flow of non-Nordic ethnic groups into the United States. While considering the legislation, the United States Congress invited testimony by a leading eugenist on the biological aspects of immigration.
Starting in the 1920s in particular, there was a huge push for immigration restrictions on people who are coming from non-Germanic, non-Northern European countries. And so people coming from Mexico to the United States, or people coming from Africa or Southern European countries that had people that the eugenists viewed as evolutionarily backwards, they had to be stopped. Because they were going to destroy our society.
But the most horrifying implementation of eugenics policies took place.
I was going to
not in
say
America,
that eagle looks familiar.
but in Nazi Germany. The Nazis ultimately sterilized more than 300,000 supposed hereditary defectives in the name of eugenics. They then started gassing the disabled at special medical facilities. It was in these killing centers that the Nazis began to perfect the methods they would later use to exterminate Jews. The sordid history of eugenics and the mainstream scientific community's embrace of it remains completely unknown to many Americans. So does the scientific community's involvement with social Darwinism and scientific racism, including human zoos. It's a history some people are still trying to cover up.
Ask yourself why they would cover something like that up. You know, I keep telling you, everybody, you've heard me say it a lot. History's a lie. History is always written by the winners and for some. And you know how I know that? We can go back. We're going to go back, right? To King James. The King James Version of the Bible, believe it or not, was written by 47 scholars for King James. And you know what's funny about King James? Dude was a Peter Puffer. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, and children of all ages, I hope you enjoyed this history lesson of the day because, well, we don't learn a lot about history anymore. And my kids, a lot of the history they're learning from, this guy. So I'm not telling you how to think. I'm just telling you to think. And I encourage every one of you to learn something new today. Well, besides what you just learned today. And urge your children. Got to create a bond. But you're welcome, everybody. Thank you. Thank you. And like I said, 8 Central tonight, I'll be back on live. I'll actually probably be on a little earlier. I don't want to miss a second of the debate. And then tomorrow, I will do the Donald Trump version of the debate while he's getting arrested. I'm just kidding. I don't know what time he's getting arrested. But I know the New York Times, or is it the Washington Post, has him getting arrested around 7 o'clock tomorrow night. But I don't believe that. Why would Donald Trump show up to the police station at 7 o'clock at night in Atlanta when there's fuck ton of traffic? Just saying. See y'all later.